She gave herself to him on their wedding night, but was rejected with cold words. Anthony Lancaster despised her, treating her like a mere contract. But when he saw another man touch his wife's arm, something inside him exploded. The man who swore he'd never love her now burns with jealousy and is willing to do anything to get her back. Can a heart of ice melt before the fire of desire? Or will it be too late when he realizes he loves her? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, also click the super thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you. The chapel was decorated with white roses and candles that flickered like tiny flames of hope. The scent of flowers hung in the air, sweet and suffocating at the same time. Liliana Hayes, now Liliana Lancaster, walked down the central aisle in a lace dress that weighed more than it should, not because of the fabric, but because of what it meant. Each step was a goodbye to freedom, to choice, to the illusion that love might someday find her. Her father, Robert Hayes, held her arm with desperate strength. She could feel the trembling in his hands. He didn't need to say anything. Liliana already knew. Willow Creek Ranch was on the verge of bankruptcy. The debts had swallowed everything, the land, the cattle, their dignity. And now the last thing left was her. Anthony Lancaster waited for her at the altar. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a sharp jawline, he wore an impeccable black suit that contrasted with eyes as grey and cold as stone. He didn't smile when she approached, didn't extend his hand with affection. He just looked at her, a calculated look, like someone evaluating an investment. When the priest asked if she accepted this man as her husband, Liliana hesitated. For a second, she thought about running. But then she remembered her father's tired face, her mother's tears, the farm that was all they had. She swallowed the lump in her throat and whispered, "Yes." Anthony's voice was firm and indifferent. Yes. There was no kiss after the vows. He just nodded, like someone closing a deal. The limousine that took them to the Hollow Estate mansion was luxurious and silent. Liliana sat as far from him as possible, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the window. The trees passed by too quickly, as if time itself were trying to escape along with her. Anthony didn't say anything during the entire ride. He typed something on his phone, his expression serious and distant. Every now and then, she felt his gaze on her, brief, analytical. But when she turned her head, he was already looking elsewhere. The mansion appeared on the horizon like a castle of stone and glass. It was imposing, cold, majestic. The windows reflected the evening light as if they were burning from within. Liliana felt a shiver run down her spine. This place didn't feel like a home. It felt like a gilded cage. Inside the mansion, everything was too perfect. The furniture was dark wood and genuine leather. The curtains were heavy velvet. There were antique paintings on the walls and a crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling like a jewel frozen in time. But there was no warmth, no life. An elegant and stern woman descended the stairs, Margaret Lancaster, Anthony's mother. She wore a grey dress and pearls around her neck. Her blue eyes swept over Liliana from head to toe, as if searching for flaws. "So this is the new Mrs. Lancaster," she said, her tone cutting. "I hope you know how to conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the name you now carry." Liliana tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "I'll do my best, Mrs. Lancaster." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested in the response, and turned to Anthony. "I hope you know what you're doing, my son." Anthony didn't respond. He just nodded and went upstairs, without looking back. Night fell like a heavy cloak. Liliana was led by a maid to the master bedroom. It was enormous, decorated in shades of ivory and gold. The bed had a canopy, covered in silk sheets with red rose petals, scattered like promises of romance. There were candles lit on the nightstands, the soft scent of jasmine in the air. She stood in the center of the room, her heart beating too fast. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to feel a thread of hope. Maybe he would be kind. Maybe there was a spark of humanity behind those icy eyes. The door opened. Anthony entered, still wearing his suit jacket but with his tie loosened. He closed the door behind him and stood there, hands in his pockets, watching her. Liliana felt her face grow warm. She held her hands in front of her body, nervous, vulnerable. "Anthony," she began, her voice low. "I know this marriage was arranged, but I'd like to try." He interrupted her with a coldness that cut through the air. "Liliana, let's make something clear right now." He took 2 steps toward her, not with desire, not with affection, but with authority. "This marriage is a contract, nothing more. I paid your family's debts. You carry my name. In public, we'll behave like a couple. But here, in this house, don't expect affection from me. Don't expect romance. Don't expect anything." Each word was like a sharp blade piercing her chest. Liliana felt tears burn in her eyes, but she refused to shed them in front of him. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Anthony nodded, as if satisfied with the clarity of the agreement. He walked to the door that connected the master bedroom to the adjacent room, his room, and stopped before leaving. "Get some rest. Tomorrow you'll learn the house routine." And then he left. Liliana stood alone in that luxurious and empty room. The rose petals seemed to mock her. The candles burned without witnesses. She looked at the bed, at the wedding dress she still wore, at her trembling hands. Slowly, as if her body no longer belonged to her, she sat on the edge of the bed. And then finally she allowed the tears to fall. Silent, painful tears from a woman who had just discovered that her marriage wasn't the beginning of something, but the end of everything she had ever dreamed. Outside, the moon shone cold and distant. And inside that room, Liliana fell asleep alone, still dressed as a bride, her heart broken and her soul exhausted. But something inside her, something that still resisted, whispered an uncomfortable truth. This can't be everything. This can't be forever. The first rays of sunlight entered through the bedroom window like unwelcome intruders. Liliana woke with her body aching, still wearing the wrinkled wedding dress. The rose petals had wilted during the night, scattered across the floor like remnants of a shattered illusion. She looked around, disoriented, until the memory of the previous night hit her like a punch to the stomach. This marriage is a contract, nothing more. Anthony's words echoed in her mind like a funeral bell. She took a deep breath, wiped her face with her hands, and stood up. There was no time for self-pity. If this was her fate, then she needed to learn how to survive it. A gentle knock on the door made her turn her head. "Come in," she said, her voice hoarse. A young maid entered, carrying a tray with tea and toast. She had kind eyes and a shy smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Lancaster. My name is Clara. I'll help you get ready." Liliana nodded, grateful for the presence of someone who didn't look at her with disdain. Clara led her to the marble bathroom, where a bathtub was already prepared with hot water and lavender petals. Steam rose like mist, bringing a scent that calmed her nerves. As Liliana sank into the water, Clara organized the clothes in the closet, a closet bigger than the room she'd had at Willow Creek. There were silk dresses, wool coats, Italian leather shoes, everything impeccable. Everything chosen by someone who didn't know her. Mrs. Lancaster, Mr. Anthony's mother, likes everyone to be ready before 8 in the morning, Clara said cautiously. "She's strict about schedules." Liliana sighed. "Thank you for letting me know." The breakfast table was long enough to seat 12 people, but only 3 were sitting there. Anthony, at the head, read the financial newspaper with an impassive face. Margaret, on the right, drank tea with an upright and elegant posture. And Liliana, on the left, felt like an intruder in her own home. No one spoke during the first few minutes. Only the sound of cups touching saucers and the turning of newspaper pages broke the oppressive silence. Margaret was the first to speak, without taking her eyes off her cup. "Liliana, I hope you've understood the responsibilities that come with the Lancaster name. You'll be expected at social events, business dinners, and philanthropic engagements. Your appearance must be impeccable. Your behavior irreproachable." Liliana swallowed hard. "Yes, Mrs. Lancaster." Margaret finally looked at her, her blue eyes as cold as her son's. "And avoid embarrassing this family. We've had enough scandals already." Anthony lowered his newspaper for the first time. His grey eyes fixed on Liliana for a brief second. Something passed through them so quickly she couldn't decipher it, before returning to the newspaper. "She'll behave appropriately, Mother. Don't worry." His voice was firm but distant, as if he were talking about an object, not a person. Liliana gripped the linen napkin with her fingers, feeling anger boil beneath the surface. But she said nothing. She just lowered her head and bit into the piece of toast on her plate, though she couldn't taste anything. The days began to blend into a monotonous and suffocating routine. Liliana woke early, had breakfast in silence, spent mornings reading books in the empty library or walking through the mansion's extensive gardens. In the afternoon, Clara helped her dress for some social event, where she smiled politely beside Anthony, pretended to be a happy wife, and returned home without exchanging a single word with him. Anthony was a constant but distant presence. He left early for the office and came back late. When they were together in public, he placed his hand on the small of her back. A subtle gesture, but one that made Liliana's heart race involuntarily. He introduced her as "my wife," with a tone of ownership that made her shiver. But when the doors closed, he disappeared to his room. They slept in separate rooms. They didn't touch. They didn't talk. They lived like strangers under the same roof. However, Liliana began to notice something strange. She felt his eyes on her. When she was reading on the living room sofa, she'd look up and see him standing in the doorway, watching her in silence. When she came down the stairs in the morning, he was in the hall, adjusting his tie, but his eyes followed her every movement. When she laughed at something Clara said, he frowned slightly, as if that sound bothered him or fascinated him. And there were moments when he got too close. It was on a cold October night that Liliana realized something had changed, or was about to change. She was in the library, wrapped in a wool shawl, reading by lamplight. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the mahogany shelves. She was so absorbed in the book that she didn't hear his footsteps. "Still awake?" Anthony's deep voice made her jump. She turned her head and saw him standing at the library entrance, hands in his pockets, tie undone, the first two buttons of his shirt open. He looked tired, but still imposing. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, closing the book. He entered slowly, walking to the fireplace. He stood there, his back to her, looking at the flames as if they held secrets. "You've adapted well," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "Better than I expected." Liliana didn't know if that was a compliment or a cold observation. "I'm trying to fulfill my part of the agreement," she replied, her voice steady. Anthony turned his head slightly, his profile illuminated by the fire, his jaw tense, his eyes shadowed. "And you are?" Silence. He turned completely toward her, taking 2 steps in her direction. Liliana felt her heart race. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that left her breathless. "Why do you accept all of this, Liliana?" he asked, his voice rough, almost vulnerable. "Why don't you hate me?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "Do you think I should hate you? I haven't given you reasons to do anything else." Liliana stood slowly, holding the book against her chest like a shield. She met his gaze, her green eyes shining in the firelight. "Hatred requires energy, Anthony. And I'm too tired to waste it on you." Something passed through his eyes. Surprise. Perhaps even admiration. He took another step. Now he was so close she could feel the warmth of his body, the scent of wood and spices coming from his skin. "You're stronger than you seem," he murmured, his voice low, almost intimate. "And you're weaker than you'd like to admit," she replied without backing down. His eyes narrowed. For a moment, Liliana thought he was going to say something important, something true. But then he stepped back, as if he'd been burned. "Good night, Liliana." And he left the library, leaving her alone with her racing heart and confused mind. That night, lying in the empty bed, Liliana looked at the ceiling and whispered to the silence, "What are you hiding, Anthony Lancaster?" And somewhere in the mansion, in the room next door, Anthony was awake, staring at the wall that separated them, fighting against something he didn't want to feel, something dangerous, something inevitable. The morning arrived with a clear blue sky, and for the first time in weeks, Liliana felt a flash of joy. Anthony had left for a business trip to New York and would be away for 3 days. Margaret was also absent, visiting a friend in Boston. For the first time, the mansion seemed to breathe. Clara entered the room with a wide smile. "Mrs. Lancaster," your father called. "He asked you to visit him at the ranch today. He said there's something he needs to show you." Liliana's heart filled with warmth. Willow Creek, her home, her refuge. "Prepare the car, Clara. I'm going home." The road to the ranch was long and winding, surrounded by green hills and ancient trees that bent like silent guardians. As she got closer, Liliana felt the tightness in her chest loosen. There was the smell of wet earth, the sound of birds, the wind carrying memories of a simpler life. When the car stopped in front of the weathered wooden house, her father was on the porch, waving with a tired but genuine smile. Liliana ran out and threw herself into his arms, feeling tears burn in her eyes. "Dad, my girl," Robert murmured, squeezing her tightly. "I missed you so much." They stayed like that for a long moment, just feeling each other's presence. Then Robert released her and pointed to the stables. "There's someone here who missed you too." Liliana frowned, curious, and followed her father to the stables. And there, fixing a fence with his sleeves rolled up and his face bronzed by the sun, was Daniel Carter. Her heart jumped. Daniel had been her best friend in childhood. They played together, rode horses, ran through the fields until sunset. He had left Willow Creek years ago to work in another state, and she hadn't seen him since. When he looked up and saw her, his face lit up. "Lily!" It was the nickname only he used, and hearing that name again after so long made something inside her break free. "Daniel!" He dropped his tools and walked toward her with long strides, opening his arms. Liliana ran and threw herself into a tight embrace, laughing as he spun her in the air. "My God, you haven't changed at all," he said, setting her down and looking at her with that easy, warm smile she knew so well. "And you got huge," she replied, laughing. "What have you been eating?" Daniel shrugged, modest. "Hard work and lots of home cooking." He paused, his eyes softening. "I heard about your marriage to Anthony Lancaster." Liliana's smile faltered, but she quickly composed herself. "Yes, it was quick." Daniel studied her for a moment, as if he could read between the lines. But he said nothing. He just smiled again and offered his arm. "Want to walk? I'm sure you want to see the horses." They walked through the fields, talking about the past, remembering childhood pranks and adventures. Daniel told her about the years he spent away, the hard work, the places he'd seen. And Liliana, for the first time in weeks, truly laughed. A light, free laugh that seemed to have been forgotten somewhere between the mansion and the marriage contract. When they reached the old oak tree where they used to climb as children, Daniel stopped and turned to her. "Are you happy, Lily?" The question caught her off guard. Liliana looked away, watching the leaves dancing in the wind. "I'm learning to live a different life." "That's not an answer," he said, gentle but firm. She sighed and finally met his gaze. "I don't know if happiness is part of the deal, Daniel, but I'm okay, really." He reached out and touched her arm, a simple, brotherly gesture. "If you ever need a friend, I'll be here, always." Liliana smiled, moved. "Thank you." What neither of them knew was that, at that exact moment, a sleek black car had stopped at the ranch entrance. Anthony Lancaster had returned early. He got out of the car with firm steps, his face serious. He had cancelled the meeting in New York when he learned that Liliana had gone to Willow Creek. Something inside him, something he didn't want to name, had pushed him back. He needed to see her, needed to know where she was, who she was with. Robert met him on the porch. "Mr. Lancaster, we weren't expecting you today." Anthony nodded briefly, his eyes scanning the ranch. "Where's Liliana?" Robert pointed to the fields. "She went for a walk with Daniel Carter, an old childhood friend. They should be near the oak tree." Anthony didn't wait to hear the rest. He walked toward the fields with long, determined steps, his jaw tense, his fists clenched. When Anthony saw them, the world seemed to stop. Liliana was smiling, that radiant smile he had never seen in his presence. Daniel was beside her, his hand still touching her arm, the two of them laughing at something he couldn't hear. And then something inside Anthony exploded. It wasn't anger. It was something more primal, more visceral. It was jealousy. He walked toward them with quick steps, the sound of his boots crushing the dry grass. Liliana saw him first, and her smile disappeared instantly, replaced by surprise and fear. "Anthony?" she called, confused. "Aren't you supposed to be in New York?" He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on Daniel, who had taken a step back, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mr. Lancaster," Daniel greeted politely. "Pleasure to meet you. I'm Daniel Carter, an old friend of Liliana's." Anthony ignored the extended hand. Instead, he turned to Liliana and, without warning, placed his hand on the small of her back, pulling her close with firmness. She felt his body warm and rigid against hers, his breath brushing her ear. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Anthony, He cut her off, leaning his head so his lips were millimeters from her ear. His voice was a hoarse whisper, loaded with something she couldn't name. "Remember who you are, Liliana. You carry my name." The tone was possessive, domineering. And at the same time, there was something more, something that seemed like pain. Liliana felt her heart race, blood boiling in her veins. She pulled away abruptly, her green eyes burning with anger. "I haven't forgotten who I am, Anthony. But it seems you've forgotten that I'm not your property." His eyes narrowed. He took a step toward her, invading her space, his body casting a shadow over her. "No?" His voice was dangerously low. "Then tell me, Liliana, what exactly do you think you are?" Daniel tried to intervene. "Mr. Lancaster, I think there's a misunderstanding here." Anthony turned his head slowly toward him, his grey eyes icy. "This is none of your business." Daniel swallowed hard, but didn't back down. "Lily is my friend, and I won't stand by while someone treats her with disrespect." The tension in the air was palpable. Anthony was about to respond when Liliana placed herself between them, her voice firm. "Enough. Both of you." She looked at Daniel with gratitude and sadness. "Thank you, Daniel. But it's okay, I'll go with him." Daniel hesitated but nodded reluctantly. "If you need me, I know where to find you." The walk back to the car was tense and silent. Anthony held her arm firmly, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to make it clear he wouldn't let her go. When they reached the car, he opened the door and waited for her to get in. Liliana faced him, defiant. "You have no right to treat me like this." Anthony leaned in, his face inches from hers, his eyes burning with something indecipherable. "I have every right, Liliana. You're my wife." "Only on paper," she shot back. He smiled, but there was no humor in that smile, only something dark and dangerous. "Then maybe it's time we change that." And before she could respond, he closed the car door and walked around, getting in on the other side. As the car drove away, Liliana looked out the window and saw Daniel still standing under the oak tree, watching them leave. And she knew, in that moment, that something had changed. Anthony Lancaster was jealous, and that meant he felt something. Something he could no longer deny. The silence inside the car was thick, heavy, like a storm about to break. Liliana kept her gaze fixed on the window, arms crossed, breathing irregular. Anthony drove with his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white from the pressure. His jaw was tense, muscles pulsing beneath his skin. Neither spoke during the entire drive, but the air between them was charged with electricity, with unspoken words, with emotions simmering just below the surface. When they finally arrived at the mansion, Anthony parked the car with a sharp jolt. Before Liliana could open the door, he was already on her side, opening it forcefully and offering his hand. She ignored the gesture and got out alone, walking toward the mansion entrance with quick, furious steps. But Anthony caught up to her in seconds, grabbing her wrist and making her stop. "Don't you dare ignore me, Liliana." She turned abruptly, her green eyes sparking with anger. "And what do you want me to do, Anthony? Thank you for humiliating me in front of a friend. Thank you for treating me like I'm some object you own." "You're my wife!" His voice echoed through the empty hall, reverberating off the marble walls. "I'm your wife on paper," she shouted back, her voice trembling with emotion. "You made that perfectly clear from the first night. You told me this marriage was just a contract, that I shouldn't expect anything from you." Anthony stepped forward, invading her space, his eyes darkened by fury and something deeper, more dangerous. And you think that gives me the right to see you smiling at another man? To see him touching you? He's my friend. Liliana pushed his chest with both hands, but he didn't move. He doesn't mean anything more than that. I don't care what he means. Anthony grabbed her wrists, pulling her closer. I don't want to see him near you again. You don't have that right. She tried to pull free, but his fingers were firm, not hurting, but holding with an intensity that left her breathless. You can't lock me up here and expect me to live without anyone. You can't treat me like I'm invisible, and then demand that I be only yours. I can, and I will. His voice was hoarse, almost desperate. Liliana stopped struggling. Their breaths were accelerated, their chests rising and falling in sync. She stared at him, eyes glistening, but her voice steady. Why, Anthony? Why do you care? You didn't want anything with me. You made that clear from the beginning. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His expression was that of someone fighting against something inside himself, something he couldn't control. Answer me, she demanded, her voice breaking. Why do you care who I see, who I smile at, who touches me? Anthony released her wrists, but before she could step away, he placed his hands on the wall on either side of her head, trapping her. Their bodies were so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of wood and spices that seemed to envelop her completely. His eyes traveled over her face, her trembling lips, her flushed cheeks, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He leaned his head forward, bringing his face close until their foreheads almost touched. Because I do care, he whispered, his voice hoarse and vulnerable in a way she had never heard before. You matter to me more than I can admit, more than I should allow. Liliana's heart stopped for a second. She blinked, confused, hopeful, frightened. What are you saying? Anthony closed his eyes, as if fighting against himself. When he opened them again, there was something raw in them, something that looked like pain. I didn't want to feel this, he admitted, his voice low. I tried to keep my distance, tried to treat this like business. But then you smiled at him, and He clenched his fists against the wall, his breathing heavy. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, something I swore I'd never feel again. Anthony. He shook his head as if trying to rid himself of the thoughts. You drive me crazy, Liliana. From the moment you entered this house, you messed everything up. I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop watching you. And when I saw that man touching you, his voice failed. I wanted to tear him away from you. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Liliana felt tears finally stream down her face. She raised a trembling hand and touched his face, her fingers sliding along his tense jaw. Then why did you push me away? Why did you make me feel like I meant nothing? Anthony turned his face, pressing his lips against her palm, his eyes closed. Because I'm an idiot, he murmured against her skin. Because I was scared. Scared to feel this. Scared to need someone again. Liliana swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. And now? Are you still scared? He opened his eyes, and what she saw in them took her breath away. Desire, vulnerability, need. I'm terrified, he admitted, but I can't pretend anymore that you don't affect me. And then, without warning, he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was intense, urgent, loaded with weeks of tension and denial. His lips captured hers with a hunger that made her tremble from head to toe. He tilted his head, deepening the kiss, and one of his hands slid from the wall to her waist, pulling her forcefully against his body. Liliana let out a sigh against his lips, and that sound seemed to awaken something even deeper in him. He pressed her against the wall, his body covering hers, and his fingers tangled in her hair, tilting her head so he could take more, feel more. She responded with the same intensity, her fingers gripping his shirt, pulling him closer as if it weren't possible to be close enough. Their lips moved together in a desperate dance, in a search for something both had denied for too long. When they finally separated, both were breathless. Foreheads together, breaths mingling in the warm air between them. Anthony slid his thumb across her cheek, wiping away a tear that had escaped. You're mine, Liliana, he murmured, his voice hoarse, but there was no command in those words. There was pleading. Tell me you're mine. She opened her eyes, meeting his, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe what she saw there. I'm yours, she whispered, But you also need to be mine, Anthony. Not halfway, not just when you're jealous. Completely. He nodded, his eyes burning with promise. Completely. And then he kissed her again. Slower this time, but no less intense. A kiss that sealed something new between them, something that wasn't in the contract. Something real. When they finally separated, Anthony lifted her in his arms effortlessly, making her let out a small cry of surprise. He smiled, a genuine, rare smile, and began climbing the stairs. "What are you doing?" she asked, laughing softly, her arms around his neck. "Taking you to where you should have been from the beginning," he replied, his voice loaded with intention. Liliana felt her heart race. But this time it wasn't from fear, it was from anticipation. When they reached the top of the stairs, Anthony stopped in front of the master bedroom door, his room, and looked at her. "Last chance to send me away," he said, his voice serious but his eyes begging her not to. Liliana smiled, touching his face tenderly. "Don't go anywhere." And with those words, the last barrier between them finally fell. The door closed behind them, and the rest of the world disappeared. There were only the two of them. Finally. The morning light entered through the velvet curtains, painting the room in soft golden tones. Liliana woke enveloped in warmth, not just from the silk covers, but from the strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against a firm, warm chest. Anthony. She turned her head slightly and saw him sleeping beside her, his face relaxed in a way she had never seen. The hard lines of his expression were softened by sleep, his lips slightly parted, his breathing calm and rhythmic. He looked at peace. Liliana couldn't help herself. She reached out and delicately traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips, feeling the slight roughness of his stubble. His eyes opened slowly, still clouded by sleep. When they focused on her, a small smile, rare and genuine, curved his lips. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice hoarse and loaded with intimacy. "Good morning," she replied, feeling her face warm. Anthony tightened his arm around her, pulling her even closer until there was no space between their bodies. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the lavender scent that still lingered on her skin. "I could stay like this forever," he whispered against her skin, his lips lightly brushing the curve of her neck. Liliana closed her eyes, letting herself sink into that moment. For the first time since entering that mansion, she felt at home. The days that followed were different, completely different. Anthony no longer disappeared to the separate room at night. He took her by the hand to their room, no longer just his, but theirs, and laid her down carefully, as if she were something precious that could break. He started coming home earlier from work, and when he arrived, the first thing he did was look for her. Sometimes he found her in the library, reading, other times in the garden, cutting flowers. And always he stopped what he was doing just to watch her. Liliana felt his eyes on her constantly, looks that were no longer cold or calculating. They were warm, full of desire, full of something she was beginning to recognize as affection. It was on a rainy afternoon that Liliana realized how much things had truly changed. She was in the living room, wrapped in a shawl, reading near the fireplace. The rain beat against the windows in a hypnotic rhythm, creating a cozy, peaceful atmosphere. Anthony entered silently, still wearing his work suit but without the jacket. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms marked by subtle veins. He said nothing. He just walked over to her, gently took the book from her hands and placed it on the side table. Then, without warning, he lifted her from the sofa and sat in her place, pulling her onto his lap. "Anthony," she exclaimed, laughing, surprised. "What are you doing?" "Enjoying my wife," he replied, adjusting her so her back rested against his chest, his arms wrapping around her waist. Liliana settled against him, feeling his heart beating strong against her back. They stayed like that for long minutes, just listening to the rain, feeling each other's warmth. Then Anthony tilted his head and pressed his lips against her shoulder in a soft, lingering kiss. Liliana felt a shiver run down her spine. "You're distracting me from my book," she murmured, trying to sound annoyed, but failing miserably. "Good," he replied, his voice husky. "That book already gets too much attention." She turned her head to face him, finding those grey eyes so close to hers she could see the golden reflections in them. "Are you jealous? Of a book?" Anthony smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that made her stomach tie in knots. "I'm jealous of anything that takes your attention away from me." And then he kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that made her forget the rain, the book, everything that wasn't him. Anthony began doing small things that melted Liliana's heart. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear during breakfast, his fingers lingering longer than necessary, sliding along her jawline before pulling away. When they were at social events, he kept his hand on the small of her back, but now the touch was protective, comforting. And whenever someone spoke to her, he leaned in to whisper in her ear, "You look beautiful today," or, "I can't stop looking at you." The words were whispered so low that only she heard, but they sent waves of warmth through her entire body. He began studying her in silence. He watched the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating, how she twisted a strand of hair around her finger when she was nervous, how her eyes sparkled when she laughed. And Liliana noticed. She always noticed. It was during a dinner at home that Margaret Lancaster noticed the change. They were sitting at the table, eating in silence, when Anthony leaned over and gently wiped a drop of sauce from the corner of Liliana's mouth with his thumb. The gesture was intimate, natural, as if he'd been doing it for years. Liliana smiled at him, her eyes shining with gratitude, and Anthony smiled back, a small but genuine smile. Margaret slowly lowered her fork, her eyes narrowed, watching the interaction with an unreadable expression. "You two seem close lately," she commented, her tone neutral but with a hint of disapproval. Anthony didn't take his eyes off Liliana when he replied, "She's my wife, Mother. It would be strange if we weren't close." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Anthony was already standing, extending his hand to Liliana. "Come on, darling, I'm tired." Liliana took his hand, feeling the warmth of his fingers intertwined with hers, and allowed him to lead her out of the room. When they reached the hallway, away from Margaret's ears, Anthony pressed her against the wall, his hands on either side of her head, his eyes dark with desire. "I can't stand formal dinners anymore," he murmured, his voice husky. "All I want is to be alone with you." Liliana smiled, running her hands over his chest. "Then what are you waiting for?" He didn't need to be asked twice. Later that night, lying in bed with their bodies intertwined and their breathing still accelerated, Anthony traced lazy patterns on Liliana's back with his fingertips. "You changed my life," he said suddenly, his voice low and serious. Liliana raised her head from his chest to look at him. "What do you mean?" He met her eyes, and there was something vulnerable in them. "I was empty, for years. I shut myself off after my father died, and my mother became what she is today. I swore I'd never let anyone in again. Never feel again." He paused, his fingers sliding across her face. "And then you came, and messed everything up." Liliana felt tears burn in her eyes. "I didn't mean to mess anything up." "No," he interrupted, smiling. "You messed it up in the best possible way. You made me feel again, Liliana. You made me live again." She leaned in and kissed him slowly with all the affection she felt. When they separated, Anthony pulled her back to his chest, holding her tight. "Don't leave me, Liliana," he whispered in the darkness. "Please don't leave me." She squeezed her fingers around his, intertwining them. "Never." And in that moment, with the rain still beating against the windows and their bodies intertwined, they both knew this was more than a contract. It was love, pure, true, inevitable. The morning began with a surprise that left Liliana speechless. Clara entered the room carrying not one, but 5 elegant boxes, each wrapped in tissue paper and satin ribbons. She carefully placed them on the bed, a mischievous smile on her lips. "Mr. Lancaster had these brought for you," Clara said, barely able to contain her excitement. "He asked that you choose whichever you like best for tonight's ball." Liliana blinked, still processing the information. Anthony had ordered dresses for her, not 1, 5. With trembling fingers, she opened the first box. Inside, wrapped in delicate fabric, was a navy blue satin dress that shimmered like the night sky. The second box revealed a blood-red dress with a daring neckline. The third, a golden dress that seemed to capture sunlight. But it was the 4th box that took her breath away. It was an emerald green dress, made of pure silk that flowed through her fingers like water. The neckline was elegant but provocative, accentuating the curve of her shoulders and décolletage. The waist was fitted, outlining the feminine silhouette, and the skirt fell in soft waves to the floor with a side slit that promised to reveal her leg with each step. Liliana held the dress against her body and looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes sparkled. "This one," she whispered. "I'll wear this one." The rest of the day passed in a fog of preparation. Clara helped her take a perfumed bath with essential oils of rose and jasmine. Then she styled Liliana's hair in an elegant updo, with loose strands framing her face, and applied subtle makeup that enhanced her green eyes and rosy lips. When Liliana finally put on the emerald green dress, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. The fabric embraced every curve of her body in a way that was both elegant and seductive. The side slit revealed her slender leg whenever she moved. Her bare shoulders glowed under the soft light. Clara sighed, emotional. "You look stunning. Mr. Lancaster won't be able to take his eyes off you." Liliana smiled, her heart racing with anticipation. Anthony waited for her in the entrance hall, standing at the foot of the staircase. He wore an impeccable black tuxedo, the tie perfectly adjusted, his leather shoes shining under the chandelier light. His hair was combed back, revealing his angular face and grey eyes that always seemed to see beyond the surface. But when Liliana began descending the stairs, he stopped breathing. His eyes travelled over every inch of her, from her bare shoulders, past her fitted waist, to the slit that revealed her leg with each step. His jaw tightened. His hands closed into fists at his sides, as if he were fighting the urge to climb the stairs and take her in his arms right there. When Liliana reached the last step, Anthony extended his hand, his eyes fixed on hers. "You're—" He stopped, searching for words, but none seemed enough. "You're devastating, Liliana." She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his fingers wrapping around hers. "Thank you for the dresses," she said, her voice soft. "They're beautiful." Anthony took a step closer, his other hand sliding around her waist, pulling her against his body. "None of them do you justice," he murmured, his voice husky. "But this one—" His eyes travelled over the neckline, the curve of her neck, her lips. "This one was made to drive me crazy." Liliana smiled, tilting her head. "Was that the intention?" His eyes darkened. "If it was, you succeeded." He leaned in, capturing her lips in a slow, deep kiss that made her forget where they were. When they separated, both were breathing faster. "We need to go," he said, his voice loaded with reluctance. "But when we get back—" He left the sentence hanging, but the promise in his eyes said everything. The ball was held in one of the most elegant ballrooms in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, reflecting light in 1,000 golden fragments. There were tables decorated with white flowers and scented candles. The music of a live orchestra filled the air, soft and romantic. As soon as Anthony and Liliana entered, all eyes turned to them. Whispers began spreading through the room. The Lancaster couple, who had previously seemed cold and distant, now radiated undeniable chemistry. Anthony kept his hand firm on Liliana's waist, guiding her through the crowd, but his eyes never left her face. He barely noticed the people trying to greet him. "Are you ignoring me because of her?" a business colleague joked, laughing. Anthony didn't even turn. "Yes," Liliana laughed softly, the sound making Anthony's chest tighten. When the orchestra began playing a slow waltz, Anthony led her to the center of the ballroom. He placed one hand on her waist, and the other held her hand, intertwining their fingers firmly. Liliana placed her free hand on his shoulder, and they began to dance. Their bodies moved in perfect synchrony, as if they had danced together their entire lives. Anthony pulled her closer, eliminating any space between them. The warmth of his body penetrated the thin dress, making her skin tingle. He tilted his head, his lips brushing her ear. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to me in this dress?" Liliana smiled, tilting her head back to look at him. "I'm just dancing with my husband." His eyes narrowed, a dangerous smile curving his lips. "You're teasing me, Liliana." "What if I am?" He suddenly spun her, making the dress skirt swirl, and when he pulled her back, her body collided against his with force. His hand slid lower on her back, almost touching the curve of her waist, his fingers pressing the skin exposed by the back neckline. "If you are," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear, "then prepare yourself for the consequences." Liliana's heart raced. She felt blood boil in her veins, her breathing becoming irregular. The way he looked at her, as if he wanted to devour her right there, made every nerve ending in her body ignite in flames. "I'm not afraid of you, Anthony Lancaster," she whispered back. He smiled, but there was something wild in that smile. "You should be." They danced song after song, lost in each other, oblivious to the world around them. His hands never left her. He touched her constantly, adjusting a strand of hair, sliding his fingers along the nape of her neck, pressing his palm against the small of her back. And Liliana reciprocated. She ran her fingers along his tuxedo lapel, adjusted his tie gently, touched his face when she thought no one was looking. The tension between them was palpable, electric, almost unbearable. It was when they were standing near the balcony, breathing the fresh night air, that Anthony pulled her to a darker corner, away from curious eyes. He gently pressed her against the cold stone wall, his body covering hers, protecting her from the world. His eyes were dark, almost black under the faint starlight. "I can't wait anymore," he confessed, his voice hoarse with desire. Liliana ran her hands over his chest, feeling the rigid muscles beneath the tuxedo fabric. "Then don't wait." He didn't need more encouragement. Anthony captured her lips in a burning, urgent kiss, full of promise. His hands slid down her back, pulling her even closer, as if he wanted to fuse her to his body. She moaned softly against his lips, and that sound almost made him lose control. When they finally separated, both were breathless, their hearts beating out of sync. "Let's go home," he said, his voice firm, determined. "Now." Liliana nodded, her eyes shining with desire and anticipation. "Yes, now." And as he led her back to the ballroom, holding her hand firmly, they both knew that this night would once again mark the transformation of what they were. No longer just husband and wife on paper, but lovers, partners, souls that had finally found their home in each other. The ballroom was filled with familiar faces from high society, influential businessmen, heiresses to old fortunes, politicians and their wives, all chatting in small groups, holding champagne glasses while the orchestra's soft music continued to fill the space. Anthony and Liliana had returned to the ballroom after the intense moment on the balcony. He still held her hand firmly, fingers intertwined in a way that was possessive but affectionate. His eyes rarely left her face, as if he were engraving each expression, each smile into his memory. Liliana felt like she was floating. For the first time since entering this life of luxury and appearances, she felt truly seen, truly desired, and not just as a contractual obligation, but as a woman who had won the heart of a man who swore he'd never love again. It was when they approached the bar that a feminine voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the air. "Anthony Lancaster, what a surprise to see you here. Accompanied." Liliana turned her head and saw a tall, elegant woman approaching. She wore a scarlet-red dress that hugged every curve in a calculated way. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sophisticated bun, and her blue eyes, cold and calculating, swept over Liliana from head to toe with barely disguised contempt. Anthony stiffened immediately. His jaw tightened and the hand holding Liliana's squeezed slightly, as if he were preparing to protect her. "Sophie," he said, his tone icy. "I didn't know you'd be here." Sophie Devereux. The name echoed in Liliana's mind. She had heard gossip among the servants. Sophie had been something to Anthony in the past, a brief but intense affair that ended abruptly when Anthony decided he didn't want commitment. Sophie smiled, but there was no warmth in that smile. "Only poison. I wouldn't miss this ball for anything, especially when I heard you finally got married." Her eyes turned to Liliana, evaluating her as if she were an object on display. "So this is the famous Mrs. Lancaster, the bankrupt farmer's daughter." Liliana felt her blood freeze, but before she could respond, Anthony stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her, creating a subtle but clear barrier. "Watch your words, Sophie," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. Sophie laughed, a high fake sound that made several heads turn in their direction. "Oh, please, Anthony, everyone here knows the truth. You married her out of obligation, to save her family's pathetic farm." She tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with malice. "It must be humiliating for you to have to pretend you feel something for a country girl who knows nothing about our world." Silence fell over the surrounding group. People stopped talking, discreetly looking in the trio's direction. Liliana felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She wanted to respond, wanted to defend herself, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. Then Anthony spoke, and when he did, his voice echoed through the ballroom like thunder. "You're right, Sophie. I married Liliana." He paused, turning to look directly at Liliana, and what she saw in his eyes took her breath away. There was pride there, affection, something deep and true, but not out of obligation, and certainly not out of pity. He took a step closer to Liliana, taking her hand and intertwining their fingers firmly, before turning back to Sophie. "I married her because she's the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. She has more grace, more strength, and more dignity in a single finger than you'll have in your entire life." His voice was calm but loaded with unwavering authority. "Liliana isn't just my wife. She's the only woman who matters to me, the only one who will ever matter." The ballroom was in complete silence now. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. All eyes were fixed on Anthony and Liliana. Sophie paled, the mask of confidence visibly cracking. You can't be serious." Anthony took a step toward her, his grey eyes gleaming with something bordering on contempt. "I'm more than serious, and if I hear you or anyone else in this ballroom disrespecting my wife again, I guarantee it will be the last time you're welcome at any social event in this city." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Is that clear?" Sophie opened and closed her mouth, unable to respond. Finally, she turned on her heel and rushed out, her heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. The silence was broken by a low murmur that spread through the ballroom. Some people looked at Liliana with new consideration. Others smiled, clearly impressed by Anthony's fierce defense. But Liliana could only look at him. Anthony turned to her, his expression softening instantly. He raised his hand and touched her face gently, his thumb caressing her cheek. "Are you okay?" Liliana blinked, feeling tears burn in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure emotion. You defended me." Anthony smiled, a gentle smile full of tenderness. "Always." He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "I will always defend you, Liliana. Against anyone. Against anything." A tear rolled down her face and he wiped it away with his thumb, kissing the wet trail it had left. "Don't cry, darling. She's not worth your tears." "These aren't sad tears," Liliana whispered, her voice choked. No one's ever done that for me before. No one's ever defended me like that." Anthony opened his eyes, and what she saw there made her tremble. There was love. True, deep, unwavering love. "Then get used to it," he said, his voice firm, "because I'm not going to stop." He pulled her into an embrace, wrapping her completely in his arms, and she sank against his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady against her ear. Around them, people began returning to their conversations, but many still cast curious and admiring glances at the couple. Later that night, when they finally left the ball and entered the limousine, Liliana couldn't hold back anymore. She turned to Anthony, took his face in both hands and kissed him with all the passion and gratitude she felt. He responded immediately, pulling her onto his lap, his arms wrapping tightly around her waist. When they finally separated, both were breathing heavily. "Thank you," she whispered against his lips. Anthony looked into her eyes, his fingers sliding through her hair. "You don't need to thank me for telling the truth." He paused, his eyes softening. "I love you, Liliana. I think I've loved you for a while, but I was afraid to admit it, afraid to feel, but tonight—" He shook his head, a sad smile curving his lips. "Tonight I couldn't pretend anymore." Liliana felt her heart explode in her chest. Tears returned, but she was smiling. "I love you too, Anthony. I love you so much it hurts." He pulled her into another kiss, slower this time but no less intense, a kiss that sealed the promise they had just made to each other. When they arrived at the mansion, He carried her in his arms to the bedroom, closing the door behind them with his foot. And that night, they gave themselves to each other again, not just with desire, but with love. True love. Love that had been tested and had won. The limousine glided through the city's silent streets, the streetlights creating a hypnotic rhythm through the dark windows. Inside the vehicle, the air was charged with a different kind of tension, not of conflict but of anticipation, of promise. Anthony kept Liliana on his lap, his arms firm around her waist, as if he feared she might disappear if he let her go. She was nestled against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with the buttons of his shirt. Neither spoke during the ride. They didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been said at the ball. The words of love, the public defense, the declaration that had changed everything between them. Now it was time to seal those words with something deeper. When the limousine stopped in front of the mansion, Anthony didn't wait for the driver to open the door. He did it himself, stepping out with Liliana still in his arms, as if she weighed nothing. "Anthony, I can walk," she protested, laughing softly. He looked at her, his eyes dark and gleaming under the moonlight. "I know, but I don't want you to walk. I want to carry you." And there was no arguing with that tone, with that look. He climbed the stairs with firm, determined steps, ignoring Clara, who tried to greet them in the hall. He had no time for social pleasantries at that moment. All that mattered was the woman in his arms and the room waiting for them at the top of the stairs. When they reached the master bedroom, their room, Anthony gently set her down on the floor, but didn't let her go. His hands remained on her waist, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. The soft light from the candles Clara had lit earlier still flickered on the nightstands, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The scent of jasmine hung in the air, sweet and seductive. Anthony took a step back, his eyes traveling over every inch of her. The emerald green dress that hugged her curves, her hair slightly disheveled from dancing and kisses, her lips swollen and pink. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion and desire. Liliana felt her face warm, but didn't look away. "And you're the most incredible man I've ever known." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile she loved so much, and took a step toward her. His hands moved up, his fingers finding the zipper on the back of her dress. "May I?" he asked, his eyes seeking permission. She nodded, her breathing becoming irregular. "Yes." Slowly, with a reverence that made her tremble, Anthony slid the zipper down. The sound seemed to echo in the silence of the room. He moved the fabric off her shoulders, letting the dress slide down her body and fall to the floor in a whisper of silk. Liliana stood before him, vulnerable but not ashamed. The way he looked at her, with reverence, with desire, with love, made her feel like the most powerful woman in the world. Anthony swallowed hard, his eyes traveling over each revealed curve. He reached out, his fingers sliding along her collarbone, moving slowly down her arm, tracing invisible patterns on her skin. "You're perfect," he whispered. Liliana took a step forward, her hands trembling slightly as she began unbuttoning his shirt. One button at a time, revealing bronzed skin, defined muscles, scars that told stories he had never shared. When the shirt fell to the floor, she slid her hands over his chest, feeling his heart beating rapidly beneath her palms. "You're perfect too." Anthony captured her hands, intertwining their fingers, and pulled her closer until there was no space between their bodies. He tilted his head, capturing her lips in a slow, deep kiss that spoke of love and desire intertwined. He gently guided her to the bed, laying her carefully on the silk sheets. The candlelight danced on her skin, creating shadows and lights that made her seem ethereal. Anthony lay beside her, propped on one elbow, his eyes never leaving her face. He raised his hand, tracing the line of her jaw with his fingers, moving down her neck, her collarbone, in a caress so light it seemed like a whisper. "I want you to know," he said, his voice low and serious, "that this isn't just desire for me, Liliana. It's love. It's everything I never knew I needed." She turned her head, pressing a kiss to his palm. "I know. And it's the same for me." He leaned in, kissing her again, this time with more urgency, more need. His hands explored every inch of her skin, memorizing each curve, each sigh that escaped her lips. Liliana ran her hands over his back, feeling the muscles contract under her touch. She pulled him closer, arching her body against his, wanting to feel every part of him against every part of her. "Anthony," she whispered against his lips, her voice loaded with desire. "Please." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, seeking certainty. "Are you sure?" More than anything. And with those words, the last barrier between them fell. Anthony worshipped her with reverence. Each touch was deliberate, full of intention. He kissed every inch of exposed skin, whispering words of love and promise against her skin. "You're mine," he murmured against her neck, his lips tracing a path of fire. "Mine to love. Mine to protect. Mine forever." Liliana arched against him, her fingers burying in his hair, pulling him closer. "And you're mine," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mine to love, mine forever." Their bodies moved together in perfect synchrony, as if they had been created for each other. Each touch, each kiss, each sigh was a promise, a celebration of the love that had grown between them against all odds. Time seemed to stop. There was nothing else but the two of them. Two hearts beating as one, two souls finally finding their home. Afterward, when their bodies finally relaxed and their breathing calmed, Anthony pulled her to his chest, wrapping her completely in his arms. Liliana laid her head over his heart, listening to the steady rhythm that calmed her. He ran his fingers through her hair in a gentle, repetitive gesture, his lips pressed against her forehead. "I'll never get tired of this," he said, his voice sleepy but full of contentment. "Of having you in my arms, of feeling you against me." Liliana smiled, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Then it's good you'll never have to." They stayed like that for long minutes, just feeling each other's presence, the warmth of their intertwined bodies, the peace that came from finally belonging to someone completely. "Liliana?" Anthony called softly. "Yes?" "Thank you." She raised her head, confused. "For what?" He looked into her eyes, and there was so much vulnerability there that her heart squeezed. "For teaching me to love again. For not giving up on me when I didn't deserve your patience. For seeing something in me that I couldn't see myself." Liliana felt tears burn in her eyes. She leaned in, kissing him with all the tenderness she felt. "You always deserved to be loved, Anthony. You just needed someone to show you that." He pulled her back to his chest, holding her tight, as if he feared she was just a dream that could disappear. "I love you so much," he whispered in the darkness. "So much it scares me." "Me too," she replied, intertwining her fingers with his. "Me too." And as the night wore on, wrapped in each other, they both knew this wasn't just the end of a journey. It was the beginning of something much greater, the beginning of a life built on true love, a life they would write together, forever. The days following that night were like living in a dream. Liliana woke every morning wrapped in Anthony's arms, his face buried in her hair, his warm breath against the back of her neck. They had breakfast together, talked about everything and nothing, laughed at simple things that would have seemed impossible before. Anthony changed completely. He cancelled meetings to have lunch with her. He came home earlier from work, just to spend more time with her. And always, always he touched her, a hand on her waist, a kiss on her forehead, his fingers intertwined with hers. It was as if he were making up for all the lost time, all the time he had kept her at a distance. Margaret Lancaster watched everything with an unreadable expression. She didn't openly approve, but she also no longer made cutting comments. Perhaps she realized the battle was lost, or maybe, deep down, she was satisfied to see her son finally happy. But not everything was peaceful. It was on a November morning, when golden leaves were slowly falling in the garden, that the peace was disturbed. Anthony was in his office reviewing contracts, when his secretary entered with a worried expression. "Mr. Lancaster, there's a woman here who insists on speaking with you. She says it's urgent." Anthony frowned. "Who is it?" "Sophie Devereux, sir." The name fell like a stone in his stomach. Anthony clenched his teeth, his jaw tensing. "Tell her I have nothing to say to her." "I tried, sir, but she said if you don't see her, she'll go directly to Mrs. Lancaster." Anthony stood abruptly, the chair scraping on the floor. "Send her in, now." Sophie entered the office with calculated steps, a cold smile on her lips. She wore a tight black dress and high heels that echoed on the wooden floor. "Anthony, darling, it's been a while." He didn't stand, didn't offer a chair, just stared at her with icy eyes. "What do you want, Sophie?" She feigned offense, placing her hand on her chest. "How cold. I just came to have a civilized conversation." "You have 1 minute. Talk." Sophie sighed dramatically and sat in the chair in front of his desk, crossing her legs. "Fine. I'll get straight to the point." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malice. "I know you married that country girl out of obligation, and I know you're now pretending to love her to keep up appearances." Anthony didn't move, but his eyes darkened dangerously. "Continue. I have a proposal. You divorce her, compensate the family financially, and we get back together. You and me. The way it should have been from the beginning." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Anthony began to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a cold laugh, full of contempt. "You really think I would divorce Liliana? For you?" Sophie blinked, clearly not expecting that reaction. "Anthony, be reasonable. She's not from our world. She'll never understand you the way I do." Anthony stood slowly, placing his hands on the desk and leaning forward. When he spoke, his voice was low but loaded with authority and contained fury. "You don't understand anything, Sophie. Liliana isn't just my wife. She's the woman I love, the only woman I will ever love." He paused, his eyes piercing hers. "And if you dare go near her, if you dare try to sabotage my marriage in any way, I will personally ensure you're never welcome in any social circle in this city again." "Is that clear?" Sophie paled, confidence disappearing from her face. You're serious. More than I've ever been in my life." He pointed to the door. "Now get out of my office and don't come back." Sophie stood on trembling legs, trying to maintain her composure. She walked to the door but stopped before leaving. "You're going to regret this, Anthony." He didn't turn around. "The only thing I regret is wasting time on you once. Now leave." The door closed behind her with a thud. Anthony came home earlier that day, his jaw still tense with anger. He needed to see Liliana, needed to make sure she was okay, that Sophie hadn't gotten near her. He found her in the garden, cutting white roses to put in a vase in the living room. She wore a simple light blue cotton dress and her hair was loose, dancing in the wind. When she saw him, her face lit up with that smile that always made his heart squeeze. "Anthony, you're home early." He walked to her with quick steps and pulled her into a tight embrace, burying his face in her hair. Liliana felt the tension in his body and pulled back slightly, worried. "What happened?" Anthony hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, but he also didn't want to hide anything from her. Not anymore. "Sophie showed up at my office today." Liliana's face closed slightly. "And what did she want?" "She tried to convince me to divorce you and get back together with her." Liliana blinked, surprised. Then, to Anthony's complete shock, she began to laugh. "She really thinks you'd do that?" Anthony looked at her, confused. "You're not angry? Jealous?" Liliana smiled, placing her hands on his face. "Why would I be? You chose me, Anthony. You defended me publicly, told me you loved me. Show me every day how much I mean to you." She leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. "Sophie can try all she wants, but she'll never have what I have. Your heart." Anthony felt something release inside him. He pulled her back into the embrace, holding her tight. "You're incredible. How did I get so lucky?" "It wasn't luck," she replied, smiling against his chest. "It was destiny." But Sophie didn't give up easily. In the following weeks, she tried everything. She spread rumors about Liliana, tried to convince mutual friends to question the sincerity of the marriage, even sent anonymous letters to the mansion insinuating that Anthony was having an affair. But nothing worked. Anthony and Liliana were more united than ever. Each attack from Sophie only strengthened the bond between them. It was at a charity dinner that everything finally exploded. Sophie showed up at the event, clearly drunk, and tried to confront Liliana publicly. She grabbed her by the arm, her eyes shining with hatred. "You don't deserve him," she shouted, drawing everyone's attention in the ballroom. "You're just an intruder who took advantage of the situation." Before Liliana could respond, Anthony was there. He pulled Sophie away from Liliana firmly, placing himself between them. "Enough, Sophie." His voice echoed through the ballroom. "You've crossed every line." Sophie tried to approach again, but security guards were already moving toward her. "I love you, Anthony," she screamed, desperate. "Why can't you see that?" Anthony looked at her, and for the first time, there was pity in his eyes. "You don't love me, Sophie. You love the idea of me. You love the status, the money, the power. But you never really knew me." He turned, taking Liliana's hand and intertwining their fingers. "Liliana knows me. She loves me for who I am, not for what I have. And that's why I'm going to spend the rest of my life by her side." Security escorted Sophie out while she protested. The ballroom fell silent for a moment, then applause began to echo. Anthony ignored everything. He just looked at Liliana, touched her face tenderly. "Are you okay?" She nodded, her eyes shining. "I'm perfect." He pulled her into a soft kiss, once again sealing their love before the world. And in that moment, they both knew that nothing, absolutely nothing, could separate them. Because what they had was real. It was strong. It was forever. Winter arrived, bringing soft snow that covered the mansion gardens like a white, silent blanket. The bare trees bent under the weight of the frozen flakes, and the cold morning air created ice patterns on the windows. But inside the hollow estate mansion, there was warmth, there was life, there was love. Liliana stood before the bedroom mirror, observing her own image with a mixture of surprise and joy. Her hands trembled slightly as they rested on her still flat belly, which held the most precious secret in the world. She was pregnant. The confirmation had arrived that morning through the family doctor that Anthony had insisted on calling as soon as she mentioned feeling nauseous in recent weeks. At first, Liliana thought it was just fatigue, maybe something she'd eaten. But when the morning sickness persisted and she realized her cycle was late, a thought began taking shape in her mind. And now, with confirmation in hand, she felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions: joy, fear, hope, love. How would she tell Anthony? She spent the entire day planning. She wanted it to be special. She wanted it to be a moment they would both remember forever. Clara helped her, complicit and emotional, prepare a small blue velvet box. Inside, Liliana placed a pair of tiny white baby booties, soft as clouds, with delicate satin bows. Along with them, a simple note, written in her own handwriting. "In a few months we'll be 3, I love you, Daddy." Anthony came home that night at exactly 7, as he'd promised. He'd been trying to be more punctual since realizing how much Liliana valued the time they spent together. When he entered the hall, Clara greeted him with a mysterious smile. "Mrs. Lancaster is waiting for you in the bedroom, Mr. Anthony. She said she has a surprise." Anthony raised his eyebrows, intrigued. Liliana loved surprises, but she was rarely so formal about them. He climbed the stairs with quick steps, his heart beating with anticipation. When he opened the bedroom door, he found Liliana standing near the window, illuminated by the soft light of candles she had scattered around the room. She wore a simple cream-knit dress that embraced her body delicately. Her hair was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and in her hands she held a small blue box. "Liliana!" he called, closing the door behind him. "What's going on?" She smiled, but he could see her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I have something to give you." Anthony walked to her, his heart accelerating. He didn't know why, but there was something in the air, something important. Liliana extended the box with trembling hands. "Open it." He took the box, his eyes never leaving her face, and slowly lifted the lid. When he saw the contents, the world stopped. Baby booties. Tiny. Perfect. White. His brain took a few seconds to process what this meant. Then he read the note, and the words finally made sense. "In a few months we'll be 3. Anthony raised his eyes to Liliana, his eyes wide, his breath caught in his throat. You're pregnant," she completed, her voice trembling. "I'm pregnant, Anthony. We're going to have a baby." For a moment he didn't move, didn't say anything, just looked at her, as if trying to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Then the box fell from his hands. He didn't even notice, and he pulled her into a desperate embrace, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Liliana! His voice was choked, full of emotion. My God, Liliana! She felt something wet against her neck and realized with her heart squeezing that he was crying. Anthony Lancaster, the man who rarely showed vulnerability, was crying in her arms. You've given me everything. He whispered against her hair, his voice broken. You gave me love, gave me a reason to live, and now you're giving me a family. Liliana was crying too now, tears streaming freely down her face. She pulled back slightly to look at him, and what she saw in his eyes made her tremble. There was pure love, deep gratitude, and a happiness so intense it seemed to radiate from him. I love you so much, she said, touching his face, wiping tears with her thumbs. So much, Anthony. He held her face with both hands and kissed her with overwhelming tenderness. It wasn't a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of promise, of gratitude, of eternal love. When they separated, Anthony knelt in front of her, his hands trembling slightly as he touched her belly with reverence. Hi, little one, he whispered, his voice soft. I'm your father, and I promise I'll love, protect, and care for you every day of my life. Liliana ran her fingers through his hair, her heart overflowing. The months that followed were magical. Anthony became even more protective. He accompanied her to all medical appointments, held her hand when she felt nauseous, read books about pregnancy and fatherhood as if studying for the most important exam of his life. He talked to the baby every night, his head resting on Liliana's growing belly, telling stories about how he met her mother, about the plans he had for the family's future. Margaret Lancaster, surprisingly, also softened. When she learned of the pregnancy, her eyes filled with tears and the first Liliana had seen from her, and she hugged her daughter-in-law with unexpected tenderness. You brought life back to this house, Margaret said, her voice choked. Thank you. On a spring afternoon, when flowers were beginning to bloom and the air was perfumed with jasmine, Liliana went into labor. Anthony was by her side the entire time, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, wiping sweat from her forehead. You're doing so well, my love, he said, kissing her fingers. So well. Just a little more. And then, after hours of effort, a sharp, strong cry echoed through the room. A girl. Perfect. Healthy. Beautiful. The doctor placed her in Liliana's arms, and she looked at that small, rosy face, eyes closed, lips forming an adorable pout. She's perfect, Liliana whispered, tears streaming down. Anthony, look, she's perfect. Anthony was paralyzed, looking at his daughter with an expression of complete wonder. Then, with trembling hands, he extended his fingers and touched the baby's tiny cheek. Hi, Amelia, he said, his voice full of emotion. I'm your father. And you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Liliana smiled, passing the baby to his arms. Anthony held her with extreme care, as if holding the most precious and fragile thing in the universe. And perhaps he was. Months turned into years. The hollow estate mansion, once cold and silent, now echoed with children's laughter. Amelia Lancaster grew strong and healthy, with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn smile. Anthony was a dedicated father. He left important meetings to play dolls with his daughter. He read bedtime stories every night. He taught Amelia to ride a bicycle in the gardens, to plant flowers, to be kind and strong at the same time. And Liliana watched everything with her heart overflowing with love. It was on a summer night, years later, that Anthony and Liliana met on the mansion terrace. Amelia was sleeping, hugging the teddy bear her father had given her. The moon shone full in the sky, silver and serene. Anthony pulled Liliana into his arms, the two watching the stars in silence. Do you remember, he said softly, when I told you this marriage was just a contract? Liliana smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. How could I forget? He turned her to face him, his hands holding her face tenderly. I was an idiot, a complete idiot, because what we have, this is nothing like a contract. This is life. It's love. It's everything. Liliana ran her hands over his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady. You saved me, Anthony. You gave me a home, a family. A love I didn't even know was possible. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. No, my love, you saved me from myself, and I will never let you go. Liliana smiled, her eyes shining. Promise? I promise. Forever. And then he kissed her, under the moonlight, with the love that had grown between them. Strong, true, eternal. Because some stories begin with contracts, but the best ones end with love. Sometimes love doesn't arrive the way we expect. It doesn't knock on the door with flowers and promises. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a contract, as duty, as sacrifice. And it's precisely in these unexpected places that it blooms with the most strength. Anthony Lancaster learned that loving isn't about controlling, but about setting free. That vulnerability isn't weakness but courage, and that the heart, no matter how much it tries to protect itself behind walls of ice, always finds a way to melt before the right person. Liliana discovered that being strong doesn't mean never needing anyone. It means choosing to stay, even when it would be easier to leave. It means believing in love, even when it seems impossible. Together, they proved that the most beautiful endings are born from the most difficult beginnings, that contracts can transform into promises, and that true love doesn't need perfection. It just needs truth. And perhaps deep down, this story also speaks to us about how we all deserve a love that sees us, that chooses us, that transforms us. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, also click the Super Thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you.